So, hello. We are back here on this Thursday evening, at least for me, evening, afternoon. It's 1 o'clock where I am. I hope you're feeling good. I hope you're doing good. And you are ready for our next iteration. Today, we will talk about testing. We will talk about how you can test your REST API, maybe some also good practices and pitfalls you might be avoiding. We will do them for sure. As in the last session, I will do a lot of errors because that's part of the deal. Cool. That said, I will make a short, very, very, very brief recap what we did last time. So I will share my screen in just a second. And here, we have this here. Let's go and add this to the stage. Let's put my face somewhere down in the corner here so you can see my whole screen. If I'm either too loud or my volume is too low, please let me know if the screen is big enough. You get the drill. This is the result of our last session, last Friday. Our beautiful web API, which allows us to delete entries, which allows us to, modify entries and, add entries. It's a small expense tracker. It has some, API calls. There, a total 4. Let's go into the code. They are here. So we have this extension method here, map expense controller, receive here to retrieval. We talked about as node tracking, for example. We're using Entity Framework Core with an SQLite database. We implemented all those beautiful controllers. Cool. Well, having those controllers implemented is nice, but you also want to have some tests. And let me open up a beautiful paint program and let's draw something together. How would you test such a thing? Well, let's start very, very casual. I will take here a brush. Let's make this a bit bigger. Ooh, that was a bit too big. I'm sorry. What you probably know is this. Let's make it in blue because why not? This typical thing called the testing pyramid, where, let's make this in 3 things, where you have unit tests as your foundation. So the majority of your tests will be unit tests. Then you have some integration tests. Integration tests. Okay, perfect. And you will have a few end-to-end tests. And to end. I'm very sorry. With the magic mouse of Apple, it's sometimes really hard to draw. And this is nice. And I guess a lot of people know that test pyramid. And how would this look in our case? Well, you can just take, the services we have. There are not that many right now. And you can just unit test them in isolation. My stance here is I'm not the biggest fan of that. So I wouldn't say it's a thumbs down, and there are occasions where this makes a lot of sense. But for my personal projects or my professional projects, I do like to do a different approach. Let's make this a bit bigger, just that we have it next to here. Good. This is the one a lot of people do, a bunch of unit tests, a smaller amount of integration tests, and here end-to-end tests. What I do personally prefer is something like that. Jip, jip, jip. And let's do this here, and let's do this here. So instead of a testing pyramid, what we will do today to some extent is to have something like, let's call it testing, diamond. It's 2-dimensional, so it's obviously not a diamond, but you get the idea. Where you have your unit tests down here, you still have them. You have a bunch of integration tests, and you will have a few end-to-end tests. The session today will almost completely only do this part here. This will be today's session. I will still talk about unit tests. I will still talk about end-to-end tests. Now, before I show you any code, I want to give you a bit of reasoning, and I will come back to that reasoning over and over and over again. Imagine you wrote your API. That is, this beautiful thing here. This API is nice, but it's just a backend. You need someone using and consuming your backend and your data. In our case, it's a Blazor front end. It could be Angular, React, Vue, or even another backend which communicates via REST with us. And these services, which are consuming your service, well, they are just a client, so they do not know about the internal stuff. They just know, for example, there is a route called API expenses, and it returns something, a JSON object, which then the front end serializes again or deserializes to an object of its representation. It shows it to the user. And we want, or I want in this case, in today's session, to be just another client. So I will be next to my Blazor frontend. I will be just another frontend. The test will be just another client. And this has a multitude of advantages, mainly for people who like test-driven development. I will show you that this is way better than unit testing to some extent. It has the advantage of testing everything in the application. Let's go here to our program CS. Oh, that was the program CS of my frontend. Sorry. This program CS we configured the last time. We will test this, which in a unit test you barely can do. You can do this in end-to-end tests, but end-to-end tests are more often than not expensive to set up, expensive to maintain, and slow to execute. The stuff we will do today is very quick. I mean, very quick. So let's go back. So we will be just another beautiful consumer of our API. Now, what is important, I hope you don't misunderstand me here. I showed you here that we will doing this part, and I will only show basically the integration part. What I'm doing is API testing. That doesn't mean there is no need for unit testing. It doesn't mean you shouldn't use unit testing or end-to-end tests. Obviously, they have their place. There are certain things which are way easier to unit tests, and there are also aspects you want to do with an end-to-end test. If we go, for example, down here to the unit test, if you have some very technical specific things you want to test, it's very hard to do this with API testing. Or your setup code will be just, so much setup code instead of so much setup code for unit tests. And obviously, then you should, take what is more pragmatic in your use case. For CRUD applications like we have, I do love API testing. Okay, what we want to do is we want to check this stuff, for example. We want to check that everything works as expected. Let's go. How do we do this? Okay, I will just create here another folder or another project. We call it our minimal API dots. Let's call it API tests. And I will use an XUnit test. That's just normal, your normal, runner. There's nothing fancy. You can just use your normal setup as you always did. Let's create that project. And yeah, why not? That fact is good. And for starters, I will just add my backend as a reference. Okay. Now let's go to the let's add should before I come to the main part. And the main part is a library called testing.mbc. And if I write it correct, mbc.testing, mbc.testing. Here's our beautiful package we want to have: Microsoft.asp.NET Core MVC testing. Now, I know there's written MVC, but you can use it for whatever you want. And the principle behind this testing thing is super, super straightforward. So let's go down here. You have your program CS, which contains all of your logic. What the Web Application Factory does is it takes your program CS and basically puts it into a server. So we have a live server which runs in memory. We will see this in a second, and just executes all your stuff. It's nothing, special in this regard. Just imagine you would run a Kestrel server, which, bootstraps your application, or even IIS or, NGIX, whatever you want. The only advantage here is because it's in memory, it's faster, and we have full control of all the services and configuration. We will do this step by step. So let's go in. Let's here at this package. I did this already. And let's create our very first test. Our very first test. And to keep it very, very simple, I will, I always open the front end. I do not know why. I don't need it right now. To make it very simple, I will create a new endpoint. Let's say hello world. The last time we had a lot of hello world endpoints, and this hello world object, or this hello world thing we have, will return a new object. Let's call it public class hello world response, or let's make it even a record. And it just has a message. We return a message. That's all we do right now. So let's say return whatever, new hello world response, with hello world. Okay, that's a straightforward endpoint. We can also execute this once more, and we take the Swagger UI and check it. Do you want to execute my stuff? Now, please, minimal API. Okay, it does that. Let's refresh this one. Sorry. And as you can see, we have here the hello world example. Let's execute this for once. Blah, 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 blah. Execute. As you can see, hello world. Okay, nothing really fancy. Let's go back to the code. How would we test such simple thing? Okay, let's go. Let's call it our API tests for now. We can find a better way. What we need is a thing called WebApplicationFactory. So we need here using var it's an idisposable web application factory, which is a new web application factory. And it wants to have your entry point of the application. The entry point of our application is that whole thing here. That's our entry point. In normal cases, it's a program. You always have this public class program, and that's what we want to do. And here is the first issue we see. Program is only defined in Microsoft Visual Studio.testplatforms.testzones. And that's not our program. That's not what we want. What we want is this here. The issue with the more modern templates of .NET is that this thing here, it doesn't have a public static class main, I'm so stupid, a public static class program with a void main inside. No, it doesn't have that anymore because the compiler does that for you. It's hidden somewhere. If you would check the generated code, you will see there's a main class, but it's not obvious anymore. And now there are two ways of dealing with this. The easiest, which I like, is you can just say, hey, this whole file is the program class. So you make that partial. You can say partial class program. So as you can see, he just says it's never instantiated, which is true. But now, if I go back, you can see the error is gone. And if I go into my program, you can also see two definitions because they are both partial. The compiler does it for you. And if you go to line 44, that's what I defined here. If we go to line 5, that's this one here. So this is your main. That's all. We just made it more explicit. The other option, and I just show you, or I just tell you, you can use it. I don't like it much, is you can use the internals visible to attribute. My issue with that is that it's not fine-grained. So there is this typical internals visible to attribute. You can define this on an assembly level. I just do it down here. It's wrong the way I do it, but I hope you get the idea. And then you could say, I want to have my minimal API.API tests. While this is working, the problem with this approach is that everything which is internal here in your whole assembly will be visible in your tests. You might argue that's a good thing. I argue it's not the best thing. So my go-to approach is just make this whole program partial and public. The chance that someone uses that program and runs a new main is very unlikely. I do not know if there's any higher risk or potential risk exposing that. In my career, I never saw any issue with that. But take it with a grain of salt. Not everything I tell you is, the absolute truth. Let's go back to our test. So now we have the web application factory. That thing just, starts your whole code here. It executes that code. That's what it does. Now, this is the server. So we have a running server. Yoo-hoo. The thing we need is something like an HTTP client or some client to communicate with our server. And this is where we can use the HTTP client method. And as you can see, GitHub Copilot knows that very, very well. Exactly, that is the code we need. This one, as we can see here, returns you an HTTP client. And we can use this HTTP client to interact with the server. And that's what we're going to do here. And, like you would do in any, he does it even correct, like you would do in any given front end or, backend to backend communication, you just make your requests. For starters, let's make this async task because the HTTP client has asynchronous methods. So let's go and say, hey, I want to have my response from, let's go, clients, and I want to make it get async. And now I just, provide the route. The route is hello world. And that's it. That is almost our test. This is an HTTP response message, and we can do whatever we want with it. We can say, okay, we can check the content. We can check, for example, status code should be 200. That's not how it works. This should be, no, should be, exactly. HTTP status codes, and there should be in a 200. Can you please, is it just status code? It is just status codes. No, HTTP status code. I also knew the last time that. Good. And it should be okay. So let's execute that test just for once. We just, done. So what does it mean? It means we did execute something on our in-memory server. And we can prove this quite easily. Let's go in here and let's add some arbitrary debug points. For example, here at Swag again. And I want to add this one here. And also here I want to have one. And here I want to have one. Now let's debug that whole thing. And we can see that we really run our code and not just some arbitrary hello world. Good. Let's go. The debugger goes in. We just create the web application factory. So I step over. Now we create the client, which instantiates the server. As we can see, now we are in. So we came from this line, create client, and we jumped into our program CS of our own project. And then we just run all the setup. You can see our DB context we exposed last time is instantiated. The app is built. If we use Swagger, which we do right now because we're in development mode, we also use this course, HTTP redirect, and obviously also our controllers. And beautifully, I use, what did I do here? Oh, sorry, let's go back. It's not, yeah, exactly. I pressed tab for apparent reason. And now, even though I press tab, let's go back. Okay, doesn't matter. Now I make the request to hello world. So the expectation is we will land in the hello world controller call. And if I press F10, we can see we are in here. That's what happens. And now this object is returned. I go back to my test. The status code is obviously, 200. I mean, what should go wrong? And I could also inspect everything. So as you can see, I can debug my stuff. And this is very, very, very powerful, at least for me, because I can not only debug the stuff inside my controller actions. No, I can debug literally everything around. I can check what happens in which circumstances. I can check, oh, okay, is my map get called? Is this called? Is Swagger called? All the stuff I can do with just a simple test. Let's go back here. This one will be successful. Okay, let's stop everything because we know this will be green. There are some convenient overloads. So as I said the last time, most of the times you will use JSON as an object for communication. And there are beautiful overloads like get from JSON async. And what we can do here is I just have to define the object which is coming back. And in my case, that would be, if we go back to the program CS here, that would be this beautiful object here because this is the response. So let's take this, let's put this in here. And now I can just say, okay, the content, the message, you can see this is this hardly typed object, should be hello world. But not only that, we can also say, hey, response should not be null. We expecting something which is in a valid state. If I execute the test, you can see it's green. So our server really did something. That's cute. And that's basically the base. We could stop here because this is all already giving you a lot of leverage. But obviously, we're not stopping here. So please stay tuned. If we have a look down here, I hope it's visible. Oh, maybe I can copy paste it. No, I cannot copy paste it. The runtime of that thing is 188 milliseconds. And well, that's not bad. If you compare it to a unit test, yes, it's way slower. That is true. But if you compare it to an end-to-end test, it is way faster. And there are certain things you can do. I will show it in XUnit to basically speed up certain things. And what we can do is we can basically in XUnit say, hey, I have an iClass fixture of a web application factory. And in XUnit, that would mean that for every fact or theory or inline data you have in your test, you have this shared object. So if I use a constructor like that, let's use a CTOR, and the CTOR gets this object injected. So that would be my factory. Let's put this in a read-only field. And instead of making this new thing here, just remove that line. And we use the factory instead. Okay, if I run that test, it's still green, which is nice. And as you can see, also the time didn't change. It's still roughly 200 milliseconds. But what happens if I do this? Let's say here's just a 2. And we will execute both tests. Then you can see that the first test always takes a bit longer. That's the case because the server still has to be, spun up. Someone has to execute your program CS, and your program CS just takes a few milliseconds. But all the tests afterwards, they don't have to, encounter this overhead of spinning up a server. So if I do this now 4 times in a row, I know the test is a bit stupid because it tests the same thing over and over again. But what we can see is that all the tests are basically roughly 1 millisecond. And only one test, which is most of the times the first one, is the one that takes a bit more time. So that means if you have a server spun up like that, and you can do the same with NUnit with the setup, and you can do the same with MS Test, you pay this toll of spinning up that server only once. And that's nice. So let me remove all of this again, because we don't need this right now. Okay, perfect. I will keep this around. I don't want to, spin up the server all the time. So I will keep it like that. The next thing we can do is we can really test our application. So our very first test, which, takes hello world, we can do this now with our own objects. Our own objects would be, if we go here to the controllers, that would be, these 4 calls. That's what we can test. But wait. I have a better idea. Let's do something artificial before, while we're at it, and then we will check our main concern. We will do it a bit differently. Let's say here we have also a hello world request. While we're at, at good practices and pitfalls, and let's say there's a name. And what we want is, this is a post now. So that's a map post because we need a HTTP body. And I have my request object here. And instead of sending back hello world, I want to send back request.name. So if I put in Steven, I should receive Steven. That's, I know how it is. Let's go back to the test. The test is still like that. The only thing we have to adopt is here, instead of get from JSON async, we can say post as JSON async. And as you can see on the right side, you can just pass in any arbitrary value. Let's remove this because we don't need this. And here now we have our object, and let's say we use our, how was it called? Hello world request. Let's take it. Let's put in Steven. And obviously there's no message here because this object we are receiving here is the HTTP response message. And we take this, let's take also using, not strictly necessary, but anyway, it's good practice. If it's disposable, you should dispose it. Now, what we want is the content of that thing. So first we still check, is that thing null or not? Then we want to check, is the status code, for example, should be okay. HTTP status codes, and then here not created, we want to have okay as a return value. Okay, with a big K. Okay. And what we want now is we want to have the return object. So how we do this, we take our response, and there is from JSON, no, not this one. This is content, and then you have here read a string. There are a lot of overloads, but I want to have a read from JSON async, which allows me just to say, hey, this object should be an hello world response object. And I want to have basically the response or hello world response. Let's call it hello world response. Hello world response is my beautiful object. I want to await that as it is a task object. And now I could just check, is hello world the same as I passed in earlier? So it should be Steven. I could also check whether or not that thing is null. That is also good practice because it's a nullable type. So let's explicitly check whether or not that thing exists. If I execute the test, we can see it's green. That makes sense. But there wasn't that much logic involved here. So it's working as we expect. But I said earlier, we are another client of our API. Now, let's imagine you are a Vue or React or Angular frontend. Imagine that for a second. Normally, you will have a TypeScript file which contains your DTO as a type or interface. It's up to you. And that reflects whatever is also done in the backend. What happens if I, let's say here, instead of a hello world request, I press now Control RR and call that thing full name. And here, instead of message, I call it customer message. It doesn't have to make sense much. Okay. If I execute my test, let's run it. That thing is green, which is nice. But the contract I had, I violated that. So I have a major breaking change here because I just, changed the properties in my DTOs. If I would have a client right now, which is loosely coupled to my DTOs or to my response and request objects, they would not work anymore. They will see just a null string in both cases because they still expect message and they still expect only name. Now, the cool thing with those API tests, especially in .NET, is you can basically make contract testing happening. How? Now, that's really easy. It's JSON. So instead of using your production DTOs and your production objects, you're more than welcome to use anonymous objects for your requests. So instead of saying hello world request, hello world response, what I can do is I can just call it, let's call it full name. Sorry, request was full name, exactly. Let's call it full name, which is Steven. Okay, that's fair. It would result in the same JSON as the object before. Now, for the response, you cannot take, unfortunately, anonymous types. You cannot define anonymous types like that for a response object. So you're more or less bound to, it does it even, to re-implement or re-declarate your response object. But let's call that test, so it's more obvious. And now I can just say here, test hello world response, and here the name. And if I just execute that whole thing, now it's still working, but let's go back and call that only name. And obviously, this thing isn't working anymore. You see, it's red. It should be Steven, but it was null. And the reason it was null is because the request couldn't be serialized in a way that this controller would understand this. So request.name is null. And obviously that works the other way around. And the cool thing is, as you could see, I refactored with tools, Rider in this case. So if you use ReSharper, you use ReSharper or Visual Studio. There's a lot of tools which can do that for you. But it doesn't refactor anonymous objects. It doesn't refactor my test object I specifically designed for taking a contract into consideration. And that is perfect. Now I do understand this takes way more effort because basically every DTO request and response, you have to have some kind of copy. So do I do this all the time? No, it really depends who is owning what. So in most of my projects, I do own the front end and I do own the back end. So it's very likely for me to make those changes on both sides happening. It's very likely for me that I can verify those changes pretty easily. There are also tools in the front end side of things where you can just check whether or not such contracts are still valid. You can use the Swagger JSON. So there are many tools if you own the whole solution to do this. You don't have to necessarily rely on this approach I showed you here. But there are cases where this might be useful. I do also know teams which strictly, cut the border between front end and back end. And so if you're a backend team, you just want to make sure your contract isn't violated. Otherwise, the front end team will come to you, just complain a lot. Okay. Will we do this for now here? Probably not. This is a bit too much. And as I said, I own both objects. So why should I do this now? But I want to give you the opportunity. If you want to do contract testing, this is a nice way of doing it. Okay, let's remove this. We don't need any of this code. What we need now is our beautiful expense tracker needs some tests. And we do this now. Let's add some tests. We know we have a client, and what we want to do now is we want to say, hey, dear client, for example, the get endpoint, because you can see, also Rider understands that there are some APIs defined, which I love, by the way. And I want to have my expense object, and it's an array of expense object or list or whatever you want, but we know it's an enumeration of multiple expenses. Let's call this a weight, and let's say expenses. Okay, so what is your problem? Let's go in. That thing is expense, and you have the problem of what? Sorry, get as JSON async. I am wrong. Obviously, I want to have this overload. And this returns just this object. So even if there would be a 500 or some error, this would be just null. So normally I don't check HTTP status codes all the time, only if this is really necessary and your frontend, for example, has to distinguish between certain error codes. But mine doesn't right now. So obviously I want to just say, hey, expenses should not be null, and because I didn't do anything, the count should have count. Count? No, that's not supported. Okay. The length of that thing should be 0 because we don't have any elements in there. Just to check that everything works as expected, let's go to our beautiful endpoint, which is here. I want to just go in here with a debug point, just that you see it's working the way we thought it's working. So let's go. Our first test, compile and execute. Let's go. I can have a coffee right now. That's perfect. Okay. Yeah, my breakpoint from earlier. I don't mind now. As we can see, I'm in there. So that's working. Obviously good. And now F10, we go back to our application, which is somewhere in the log. No, I don't want to go there. Ooh, I pressed the wrong button. I want to go back to my API test. I want to go back here. Okay, let's go. Let's continue. Oh, I wanted to be really in there. It doesn't do it. Sorry, I wanted to debug and I wanted to be here, but it doesn't do what I wanted to do. Let's go. Because I just want to show that we have the ability to also debug, obviously, our objects. So let's go, continue, and as you can see, we can just check what is in there. And that's very, very beautiful. Okay. Let's kick this out. Yeah, this test is not really great. This test is really, really bad in the sense of imagine I just would return here an empty list. The test would still be valid. The test would be, green. But yeah, it doesn't make much sense. And what we can do, and this is very, very nice, is we can basically tell our database, hey, add some stuff in your database. How do we do that? First, in our factory, we have here services. This thing there is your iService provider of your program CS. This is basically whatever you configured here, whatever service you configured here, you will have it available in your test. So what I can do is I can just say, hey, give me a quick required service, which would be our expense DB context, and do things with it. I could say that's the DB context, and I can just say, hey, dear DB context, I want to, on the expenses, add, for example, another expense. Let's call it new expense. Test, it has a value of 100. It has, yeah, let's say no category for now. I'm lazy, and it has a date only, which is we have 2024. We have July, and today is not 25th. It's even written top here. Oh my God, Steven. And then we want to save that thing, and that's cool. Save changes async. I do not have to know how it looks like. I just want to make it happen. And then obviously this thing shouldn't be null anymore. Now here is a problem. The issue is it tells you it cannot get expense DB context because it's a scoped service. So last time we checked a bit about a lifetime. So there's transient, there's scoped, and there is singleton. And if you use add DB context, that thing here, or mainly this one, is only registered scoped. We don't have a scope right now. So if you just do what I did here, you do not have a scope. So how do we do this? Well, it's straightforward. We can just create a scope. You can just say, hey, I want to have my factory scope. Let's call it scope. Factory, then services, and then there's this create scope or async scope. We can use both. And then we can also say here await using. And from the scope, I can say, hey, now I have a scope. Give me the service here. And the scope basically ends down here. I could also, in theory, I wouldn't need the scope here anymore, but it doesn't matter. That's also not harmful. And now we have basically kind of a request object, or we kind of, save something, and this should be basically failing because obviously we have an object, don't we? Okay, let's do this. Let's run the test again. And as you can see, it's running, and we can see, oh, there is one element. And that makes sense. It's exactly this element here. So this should be one, shouldn't it be? We can say, hey, this is the first element. And I hope now GitHub doesn't do it the way I want. We have a name, that should be test. Exactly. We have expenses, 0. Amount should be 100. And, well, it's not the amount, it's value. But, he tries his best. And it's late. And we have categories which should be empty, but it shouldn't be null. And we also want to say this. Exactly. Now this looks like a very, very fine test, doesn't it? Okay, let's execute this. Oh, wait, what's going on? Now we have 2 elements. Why? Whoopie loopy. Well, let's debug this. Let's go in and let's check what comes back. We saw 2 elements are coming now back from our backend. Why is this happening? Okay, now we're debugging. We are still in our code. That's the breakpoint I used earlier. Let's continue. And what we have here is now expenses. And now there are 3 elements. And as we can see, those elements are always the same. It's always basically this thing. What's going on? Well, I can show you what's going on. Let's launch the real program for now. So, and as you can see here, no, wait, why is it not showing the way I want? Here's the API. I will just show it to you in a second. Text 1, 2, 3. No. Wait. What did I do? Here is, oh, yeah, exactly. So the problem is I use the real database. Can I? No. I use this database here. So if you check here, I configured the data source in my builder service at DB context. So the test and the production code is sharing this line of code, which means that every request I make in the test will use this database, but also every request I would do on localhost would fill or remove entries in that database. And that is not great. That is absolutely not great. And this is where another thing comes in handy. Um, we can make this pretty easy. I will show you a multiple ways of how to deal with such things. For starters, let's, instead of having this hard coded somewhere, let's put this into the app settings. So, for example, we have app settings development or app settings, pardon me. And normally you can just add connection strings, as you can see here, and we have a default connection string. And instead of server localhost, let's take this. Let's take this entry. Okay, easy. Password 123. Well, I hope not that someone really did this in real life, but you never know. Okay, now we have the expanses DB in here. And instead of using this hard-coded string, let's take the configuration manager. This is here under builder, exactly, configuration, get connection string, and we called it default connection. Default connection. And we can, in theory, also put this, let's put this out. I have an idea. Let's put the connection string out here. Var connection string is this object, and we pass that object here into our use SQLite method. Obviously, if I debug now, let's go back to the test and let me debug my test. We will see that we will have this string. Oh, sorry, app settings is here. We will have obviously this string. So if I look at connection string, you can see data source is expenses.db. So that's not great because we're, again, sharing state between our front end, our production code, and our test code. The cool thing is this beautiful factory, let's put this here for a moment, has a lot of things you can configure. And one of those things, obviously, is your app settings file. Let's just add dot here. I showed you earlier, services can be used to retrieve the dependency injection container from your production code and do whatever you want. Nice. Another thing you can do is with Web Host Builder. And with Web Host Builder, let's go here. Let's call it builder. And let's do this. And let's just do b dot. You can see a certain amount of beautiful methods like configure services, which, you may get the idea what is going on here. We will see this later. And you can do something like get settings, use settings. Oh, isn't that convenient? Configure app configuration, and build we don't need because this is used internally. But what we can use is use setting or configure app configuration. So the Web Application Factory gives you full control over your configuration, over your service container. And with those two measures, you can do a lot. Why would you do this? Well, in this case, I want to, fake something out. I want to basically have control over the database, and the database should be different in a testing scenario, and it should be different in a production scenario. Okay. Configure services basically allows you to overwrite services you already have in your container. Imagine locally you're running your tests and you are depending on, I do not know, some external queue, some Kafka queue or some RabbitMQ, and it's not available locally. There are two ways you can go down there. You can either use test containers. We can do this in a future episode where you basically spin up a Docker image. Inside that Docker image is running then RabbitMQ, Kafka, or whatever you're using. Or alternatively, you just provide a fake. You just define a class which you implement into your tests, and you can bring it under your control. And so even though we are running our production code entirely in this with Web Host Builder, we still have the opportunity to override certain behavior so that we are super confident in a stable test. Because obviously, sometimes, imagine you have multiple test agents at the same time, and those multiple test agents would connect to the same instance, then probably, you have flaky tests. And that's not great. Now, we want to do this. I want to say for my test, I don't want to use the production database. I basically want to overwrite my connection string. And the way it works is you can just say default connection. No, but this is wrong. And sorry, not default connection. We have connection strings, string. And then this is this typical identifier. If you want to go from, let's go in here, connection strings. I forgot the S. If you want to go one nesting below, let's go this. And we want to say that thing runs in memory. And now let's debug that test again. Let's go. Let's press on debug. I need like elevator music to speed up the debugger. Okay, and as you can see here, you see it probably on the right already. If I go over connection string, you see data source is memory. So what we did is basically we still are using SQLite, but instead of our production database, which is this expenses DB, we are using an in-memory database, which is awesome because this in-memory database is pretty easy to spin up, and it's also easy to delete because after the service container is not valid anymore, the in-memory database is also gone. So after basically this line down here, the in-memory database is gone. If we continue, let's press F5. Exactly, we are in here because that's the create client call. Let's continue F5 and let's go back. And there's an internal server error. That's interesting. And I want to know where this internal server error is coming from. It's coming from only the last. That doesn't make sense. Let me debug that test once again. Now I'm curious. What's the issue? It could be that this data source string memory is wrong. SQLite, I'm pretty certain it's correct, but you never know. The good thing is now, SQL data source, I just have to check what is in-memory database for SQLite. And it's just that data source. Is it really just because I need this one? That would be lame. No, internal server error. HTTP client extensions. So something is not right when he tries to deserialize stuff. And I would be interested where this is coming from. This is only from only this line. Oh no, here. Okay, okay. That's also easy. Now we can debug. So why should we debug? Let's go in here because probably it's happening here. I like that. I like that you can debug this stuff. Okay. Do we ever enter await context? That would be my first question. Yes, we do. If we press F10, then what happens? We can see here is an exception. This line will fail. And the exception is there's no such table expenses. That is fair. If we go back to the expense database, it will be created. Okay. That is my issue. Again, we are yeah. Is it I guess it's because it's not shared. That is my personal guess. So if we say this thing is shared between instances, does this test go green now? Indeed, it does not. Who had thought of that? Let's debug this again and check where my issue lies. SQLite database mode. Okay. Expenses. No such table as expenses. I do know that. So maybe I'm not sure if this is a red herring or not. So it complains that that thing is not available. That's fair. But what we did here is to tell that the database ensure created should create all the tables. So my current way of thinking is that only memory exactly. my shit. Can I just do this? That should also work. That should be fast. That should be almost the same thing. Let's try it. Let's try it. Interesting. Connection strings default. So it knows that there's a database. It also knows that something is there, but then it has problems deserializing that object. Okay, let's go into debug mode again. I'm hooked. Why is this happening? If I just check the database again, Microsoft internal DB said no such table. SQL, no such table. And this is in memory. That's the interesting part. Ensure created is called stop. In SQLite, let's try another. Let's close that. I'm still thinking that because one thread is creating that thing and another thread is using it, because your server is running in a different context than those requests that are coming in, basically this thing here. That thing is not shared, so there's an exclusive log. And because it's still open, no one has the ability to retrieve stuff from your database. Okay, let's go in. Hopefully this is working right now. Okay, wait. Oh, it's working. Woo. And then we go through, we can say there's one element, which isn't true the case. Oh, there's nothing inside. And I am... Okay. So we can basically take another approach and check what is the problem here. We can check what is our DB context. Let's check this for a second. What is the connection string of that DB context? It should be the same in-memory one we had earlier. Let's go. Let's go into debug and let's check out what is DB context.database basically. That's the object I'm interested in. As you can see, we are really saving something in that in-memory database. Let's go here. We have the database object. Do we have any way of retrieving the connection string? That would be very, very beautiful. But I am not sure if we can do that. DB context get connection string. Let's Google stuff. And connection. There's a connection object. Okay, yeah. So we have the database, and we have a connection object. No, we don't have a connection object. Get DB connection, and then we have a connection string. And this is still pointing to the old one, and now I have to check what did I do wrong? Because obviously, from the service provider, we are retrieving the real context. So we are retrieving this object here. And we saw that this one, if I go back here, has the in-memory version. Now, why is the in-memory version here working, but in our beautiful production code, it isn't? Okay, we can see here that, expenses DB. Okay, that makes sense. Now that's at least a very coherent default connection. I have here the, default connection. Data source, connection strings, and this should override this. Default connection. Did I do something wrong is my question. Let's put this here away for a second. Connection strings, default, exactly. And I want to have shared. Okay. Connection string. Default connection. Let's execute this one more. But was 0. Okay. That is very interesting. And it even is interesting that there's always 0, because even though, there are different connection strings, because if it's using the production DB, well, then I expect multiple times that I will add always this entry, and this entry should be there multiple times, and not only 0 times or 1 time. Now, because I executed like 4 or 5 times in a row, it should be there 4 or 5 times. And my debugger doesn't want to come up. That is almost lovely. Let's end this again. Let's try to run it again. Dear debugger, it would be very lovely if you start now. Okay, you don't start, huh? Can I just kill it? What if I just run it? And then it works. Can I debug you? Please. Okay, something with the debugger is horribly wrong. And my go-to fix is choose and just, open it again. Take writer, let's go. And do it from scratch again. Now, I hope that I can debug now again. That would be very cool. Let's go here, debug. Initializing debugger. Yeah, I know my face is in the way, but here you can see initializing debugger. That is good. Okay, still, I am not sure why the connection string is using data source expenses DB and is not using connection strings. That is a good question. Web Application Factory. Now, the good thing is I can just check online what is wrong. I have a different idea. I want to check something before I continue. Let's go off the rail. Let's say use setting test. We don't nest anything, and test has foobar. Okay, easy. What happens if I say here foobar is builder dot configuration dot connection, not connection string, just get something, which is test. And my expectation here would be, what do you want? You want which data type? You want an action builder. No, I want to add a get children, get section. No, that's the section. I want to just have get value of test. And your data type is what? Get configuration. You want to have a no, I just want to have a string. Okay. What happens if I run that? Now, my expectation would be foobar for obvious reasons because I set that value explicitly. But my debugger is coming up. Okay. No, it's null. That is interesting. That is very, very, very interesting. And now the question is, why is this the case? Web Application Factory. We have the connection string, get connection string. And I'm pretty certain builder use setting. Test is also uppercase. Yeah, that looks very good. So I'm still struggling to understand why on God's green earth this one is not working. We have this factory with web holder. I made a oopsie. You see, that's good that we walk here together. So the factory here and the factory here. So you can see this perfectly here. I have this factory. I tell the factory with web host builder. Okay, easy. But the thing is, it creates a whole new object. So it's like immutability. So whatever I do with web host builder in here is only reflected if I, put this in a new factory. And if I do it then here and just take the factory here, then obviously we have the overwritten strings. And it took me like literally 5 minutes to figure that out. That's on me. That's good that we do this together. It's good that we're doing it live because, it can happen to you as well. Let's go. Let's press the debug button. What happens now? Okay. We have, look at this data source file, memory, cache shared. Exactly what we defined in our test. That thing is still, for apparent reasons, not foobar, but, I'll take that for now. And I don't want to debug anymore. I just want to continue. I say add this thing, save that thing. And now here should be there should be elements. Oh, you can see there's one element. And this element has test, it has 100, it should be empty, and the date is correct. Wow, we did it. Woo! Perfect, the test is green. It took me only 10 minutes to make that work. Okay, so just to recap, it is freaking important to understand that if you call with Web Host Builder, that you will get a new factory. And you have to use that factory. Because the other approach I took with basically ignoring this immutable object would mean, hey, whatever I configured here is lost. Like it was never there because I didn't use the object which was returned with Web Host Builder. Ooh, there was a mouth load. But we're in a very, very, very good shape. I want to show you a last thing because I don't want to put in the other things now. I guess that's not so so exciting because we do this over and over again. Probably I would move this into the constructor here. That would be the easiest. So we can just say, hey, via default, always use this setting. And then obviously I can just, remove this code down here and use my factory. Because for all my tests, I want to have the same thing. For all my tests, I want to have the case of overwritten database. One thing I want to show you is what I explained earlier, how to mock specific services. And we can make this easy. Let's make an easy example, which is, very accessible. Let's remove this. No, don't remove this. Let's say we have an interface, greeting service, and that greets with a name. Yeah, why not? Why not? And instead of hello world, that is still fine. We, we put in here. Exactly. Sorry. Let's make an implementation of that happening. It's the greeter service, and that's hello name. That's fine. And what we're doing right now is we put this service into the container add scoped the greeting service with the greeting service. Cool. Now I use this in the service down below. So that's my service. And this just returns service.greet. Yeah, Stephen. Let's take a hard string. You could probably also have a request DTO and just pass in whatever you want. But that's not what I want to show. What I want to show is if we go back and we just write another test, fact public async task should get greeted. I say like here, I have my factory. I want to have my client. And and with my clients, I just say get string async because we just return a string. That's not a JSON object. That's a very, very simple string. We say also await here, and we have the route, which is still hello world. Hello world. Exactly. And then this is the return string. And this one, for obvious reasons, should be hello Steven. Again, the name was fixed and there's always hello. So let's listen here, execute, and I still have it as a post. I'm very sorry. Obviously, this has to be a get and not a post because I'm using get string async, and that thing is green. Woohoo. Imagine now what I meant earlier. This one is a very, very heavy dependingly on third-party service. So something like Kafka or so. And you don't have this available right now. And you don't care so much. What you care is that certain things are triggered or you retrieve, predefined things. What you can do is you can just say, hey, I have my fake greeting service, which is an iGreeter service. So this is the only thing you have to be aware of is that those interfaces you are faking, they have to be public, but they have to be public also if you use something like mock or and substitute or whatnot. And yes, I could also right now use and substitute or mock. I'm just a big fan of using fake services instead of third-party libraries, but that's just me. If I just say return just the name, don't return anything else, and I tell here now I have to use with web host builder again, with web host builder, where I configure my service, configure services. And now I have my service container. And here I can just say, hey, add scope. For my iGreeting service, I want to use my fake greeting service. And as before, now it's important to understand this one is a new factory. So until this point here, let's not call that S, let's call it SC for service container. And let's put this magic out. Let's put it here, local factory. Very good name, I know. And here we are just using local factory.create client. And now let's put a debug point in here and execute that test in debug mode. Let's go. I should get greeted. I love that title. Really, really good. Okay. As you can see, we will land inside our fake service. So you can bring everything under your control. You do not have to rely on that, everything is up and running. You can build this incrementally, and that is very, very good. So, and if we go here, then we obviously go into this fake greet service thing. And this one obviously doesn't work. It's red because I just returned just the name. I don't want to debug, but thank you. So this gives you the opportunity to control literally everything. Now, to wrap this up, why do I like this approach? As I said earlier, you can just write this. So you can just say, hey, let's even remove this part of faking stuff. Let's say, it does nothing. The cool thing is you do not need anything. You do not need the services. You do not need necessarily even the DTOs, because those DTOs you could, in theory, define here in your test, not in your production logic. So if you're a big fan of test-driven development, where you just write the test first, it's way easier to do that. Also, if you refactor, big problem, or at least in my experience, a big problem with unit tests is that it's very likely, depending on the size of your refactoring, that some structure will fail, and therefore also your tests will fail because they're not compiling anymore. I do know that a lot of people say that you write your tests wrong, but it's first damn hard to get that right, generally. A second, even if you do that completely correct, the only surface you're using is somewhat an interface. You have to use either an interface or specific class in your test. So if a public method changes to some degree and has a major breaking change because of a refactoring, your unit tests, they will fail. It's almost impossible to put out structure out of the equation. But you can take out structure in API testing, because the only structure you need is a REST API endpoint. You need a request object and a response object. And all of those three things you can set up in your test. The quality of the tests, in my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, is very, very good, because you can basically test use cases. You're not bound to only send one request. You can set a cascade of requests, mimicking basically a real live use case. There is one big downside to this whole approach, and the big downside is, as we saw earlier, I got an issue because I misconfigured something up here in my client factory. And the only thing we saw is 500 internal server error. So even if there's no internal server error, just imagine instead of one element, for some apparent reason, I get 10 elements back. The only thing you know is something went wrong. You do not know in which layer of your application that thing, went wild and did something it shouldn't do. That is the biggest problem with API testing. You have absolutely no clue where exactly does your test fail. Where does your production logic does not do what it should do? For me, it's only half that bad because, again, we can just go in and debug everything. So if we go in here, even if you say, let's I could make it, I have a better idea. Let's stop that. Let's stop that. No, I want to say here, instead of to list async, let's just return nothing. Let's just return an array empty. That's a very bad example. Why don't you want to return an array empty? Return type is, sorry. Yeah. Is that, and then we close it. I know nothing is used, but why is it still trying to debug? Oh, you know what? This is now my go-to. Just close writer entirely, and then reopen it. JetBrains, please fix that. Okay, so what happens now is the test obviously is red. So let's go. Let's execute the test. That will be red. Run selected test. Let's just, both of them. Why not? Okay, it's failing because, it expects one element, but there is 0. And that is the problem. We do not know in which layer this, issue happens. But what we can do is just, press the debug button and go through the stack ourselves. And I do know that can be cumbersome. And if you have some services or some layers where you normally have a lot of errors, then, feel free to add unit tests. Let's go in. We save that thing in the real database. And then we go in there and we can see, oh, wait, I can also replay. That's also something cool. Let's go back here. I want to go in here. And so we are in here. And now my task as a developer would be, obviously, if there's not an array empty, but another service call, drill down those services and check where the issue is arising. That would be now my task. And that might be easier with unit tests. Also, what I said at the beginning, technical concerns are very, very, very hard to test. It depends, obviously, on the technical concern you want to trying to implement. But generally speaking, oftentimes you come better with unit tests. Imagine now, out of the blue, you have caching and you really want to check some caching logic. Caching is normally very transparent to the client, so you do not see a difference in the output. What you have is an input, that's your DTO, and you have an output, that's the DTO coming back. But a cache it's just transparent. You do not see where it is in those layers. So it's really hard to write an API test which tests your cache. Maybe you can check something like cache invalidation and stuff, the opposite case, but you cannot test the positive case. There you might be better off, just using unit tests. Again, it's not about, removing unit tests. It's not about removing end-to-end tests. It's about a shift in the picture of you write more API tests with the point of view of your client. That could be either like an Angular client, or you can just see it also more abstract, your business client, because you can really write use cases as test. So you have living documentation. At least that's how I see it. Cool. That is basically all I wanted to show with the Web Application Factory. Again, the important bit is the following. You have this package, this one here, Microsoft.asp.NET Core MVC testing. That is the whole deal. If you want to build this on your own, if you want to check out certain things, I will just bring it up here once again. The whole code you saw, let's make this maybe a bit bigger. The whole code you saw, so this expense tracker, is hosted under Net8 Web API Workshop. And here on the backend, you have the stuff. And as you can see, by the way, we already here on the main branch, there is also the Web Application Factory. So if you're interested in, just fiddling around with that, you can just go in and check out what I did here. Here, for example, I also used a different approach. That's also very interesting. Cool that I, after 2 months noticed what I did 2 months ago. You have the ability to override services. There's a reason you like AdScope doesn't really work with DB context because internally it uses try-add. So if you just add another one, like you call add DB context another time, it doesn't do anything. So if you have even those services, you can completely override them, which is perfect. It allows you really a great flexibility in writing your tests. You could even mock every external dependency away if you want. Now, don't be afraid of like real databases. I did this here because it's just easier. But even if you have an SQL server or something, it is not bad to test them. And it gives you more confidence in what's going on in your code. So if you're interested into that, there's here link.net /net8 web API workshop. For those who are joining this session but didn't check out the last session, this is basically a very simple crude application. It's a web application. It consists out of a Blazor frontend and an ASP.NET 8 backend, and you have like step 1 to 10. So you can start from UI only, where you just have the UI, and you have to build everything from scratch, the whole web API. And every step is basically guiding you through the simple steps you can do. And one of the steps, and that's step 10 here, is the web application factory. Well, what's up for next time? That really depends on you. Next time, probably, very, very likely, not next Friday. It will be in 2 weeks. So it will be, let me check that here. It will be the 26th plus 2 weeks. You can do the math on what that might be. It probably will be about Signal R, maybe, and maybe some other topics. I am to 100% certain and honest, I have no idea what we want to do besides that. I would probably close the chapter on those simple ASP.NET Core web APIs. We could also go more into detail of entity framework. We could do completely different other stuff. We can also check out Blazor. I will make, oh no, wait, there's not only Signal R. I lied. There's also the whole topic of logging. There's the topic of middleware and global exception filters. Basically, those 3 steps down here. And they are quite often an integral part if you write web APIs, because they allow you, at least those 2 things down here, they allow you to streamline and some of the code into central objects which are executed every time. Global exception handler, as the name might suggest, if you have unhandled exceptions for whatever reason, you might want to handle them because you don't want to, send maybe very security sensitive information to the front end. But you know what? That is up for probably in 2 weeks, maybe before. I will let you know. I will put it on YouTube and the other channels when I'm online the next time. If you have suggestions, please let me know. We can go off road, we can go off the rails entirely. It doesn't have to be ASP.NET Core. It should be .NET and C#. We can also do Angular. I do Angular quite a bit. But that is totally up to you. Well, that's it. Thanks for tuning in, and I wish you a very, very lovely day. And yeah, I hope I see you next time. Let me know in the comments what you want to see. That's it. Bye bye.